You don't trust me, Ellen?
Excuse
I'm
me?
sure I just want to get Brother Morgan's approval.
Yep, you can always,
That's the one he gave me. It's exactly
You
the
can always-
one.
hold on one second.
I have it too.
Always trust Ann, that is for sure. All right, hold on one second. I've got another person who's calling, who's typing, saying she needs the Zoom invite, so give me a second. I'll get it. Hi, Maya. All right. All right.
That's it, Ellen.
Hi, Helen.
Which one?
Good.
Talking on the phone.
All right. Great. All right, everybody. Let's close that up for a minute. And there's Sherry who's joined us, which is great. Okay. We'll see a few. And Helen is going to join us in a few minutes. And everyone else will just watch it on YouTube. So welcome, everybody. I apologize about last week, but I think it was worth it to get everyone vaccinated over here. It's very exciting. One of the perks of living in congregant housing. So sorry to everyone else who hasn't gotten it yet. I hear you can sign up online, but it's a little bit complicated according to the radio to get an appointment. But,
Yeah.
Just ask Andrea Wilder.
My
Oh my
doctor
God.
suggests that people should choose early hours, not medium or late hours,
Yeah.
because you could miss if you do that.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I received a letter from Beth Israel Leahy, Mount Auburn,
Well,
saying they will contact everyone 75 and older starting now and give you appointments. So I think, and I know a friend who's older who got one last night. So I think they're starting with the oldest and moving down.
That's
And
wonderful.
that may be the best way to do it.
I'm not older, but I got that. No, I got that text and I went on it and you couldn't get through to the appointments.
Oh, well, I haven't gotten the text yet. So
That's the benefit of living at 100 Center Street
Yes.
in your life.
Who's at 5836?
This is Kent. Can you hear me?
Hi, Kent. Oh, great. It's Kent. Okay, good. Sounds good. All right. Great, Kent. All right. So I think we'll get started. Kent, we were just talking about the travails of trying to sign up for a vaccine appointment if you're not a resident in a congregant senior housing facility. But you're not at that age yet, like me. The only reason I got the vaccine is because I work in this context. So.
And it's a good thing.
Oh, by the way, Rabbi, I hung the Kibbutz Shabbat bag on your doorknob upstairs,
Oh,
along with the Haggadah.
oh, great. Thank
Kept
you.
all the other food.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I'm sorry that the people in Canada, my reach as the delivery boy only extended to the PCB and a few of the, and actually one apartment building in Brookline. But I couldn't make it to Cambridge to.
Well, you know, I had not sent you an email, but I used the link in your newsletter
Yeah.
to reply each time.
Yeah.
Apparently didn't get there all of the 3 times I did it.
I didn't get that one exactly.
I tried 3 times.
Weird. And someone else responded 3 times, and it recorded each one of them. But anyway, all right. So great. So everyone is here. So this the point of today's conversation is to begin to talk about one of the topics that is of most importance to many of the people that that were on the original call. And I just want to make it clear that I am always open to feedback. That Rabbi Jim, this is not interesting. This is not important. I don't care about this. I can't promise, of course, that everyone is going to agree with you. So you might have to put up with it anyway. But the part of the goal of becoming a bar bat mitzvah, regardless of whatever your age is, right, is to increase your comfort level in Jewish spaces, right? And one of the things that is very intimidating about Judaism, and I think this goes across the board, all the way from Orthodox services to Reform services, right, is that there's a lot of words in Judaism, right? There's just a lot of pages, and the books are heavy, and it feels sometimes like the service is going to just go on forever and ever and ever. And what are we doing, and why are we doing it, and all that kind of stuff. I grew up. Everyone here knows that I converted to Judaism. I grew up in the Episcopalian tradition, which is, like Judaism, a liturgical religion, meaning that there's a set liturgy that you say pretty much whether it's every day or every week, right? And then what changes week to week is the readings that we do. And then, of course, sometimes there's special liturgy having to do with holidays. So that's very much the way, and it says here my internet connection is unstable. Did everything I say come through to everyone, or should I repeat it?
Yes, it has so far. It's so good so far.
Great. Okay. So that's very much the way the Jewish tradition works as well, right? That in all but the most non-traditional settings, right? The liturgy is not going to change from week to week or from day to day, right? The changes that happen, right, are going to be according to the season, right? So there will be this addition to the prayer service, or this piece will change slightly because it's a different time of the year. So it'll be the Torah portion that we read, and the Haftarah that we read. And then sometimes, of course, if there are extraordinary events, like there just was, were extraordinary events in our own country, right, we may add prayers that we would otherwise not include. So let's see who this is. Oh, Lisa, how are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you for letting me join.
Good. This is everybody. Lisa and I have not met yet, so it's very nice to see you, Lisa.
Yes, nice to meet you.
And so I'm Rabbi Jim, and we'll do introductions in a little bit. Lisa, we're just beginning the conversation about the prayer service in Judaism, and just saying that it's a very liturgical based religion, right? That we tend to use the same service week after week after week. Unlike, say, for instance, like in a Baptist church, right, where there's a liturgist, right, and the services really will change quite a bit, sometimes from week to week, and there'll be different prayers that are sung and different hymns that are used. So that's that's also something that's different in the Christian church, right? Is that there's a hymnal, right, and the church, whoever's in charge of the music will choose certain hymns based on the time of the year and so on and so forth. In Judaism, right, we tend to have the hymns that are written in the prayer book, right? It used to be that there were a lot more hymns in the prayer book, right? But then, for whatever reason, in our tradition, remember that Jews love to collect things and to put them in the Siddur, right? But Jews really don't like to throw anything away, right? Hoarders, right? And so, and part of the problem with being a liturgical hoarder, right, is that you end up having two choices, right? You have the choice of picking and choosing what you say in a given service, right? And in Orthodox prayer books, I don't know if this one does this, but so in Orthodox prayer books, you'll see, if you look closely, right, you'll see that some of the words are really, really big, right? And some of them are not so big, right? So the really big ones, by and large, are the words that really matter, right? Those are the really important ones, right? And the ones that are smaller, well, if you're really rushed, maybe you don't have to say every single one of them. Don't say that. But at a certain point, right, in an Orthodox setting, it became very important to say every single word, right? No matter how quickly you said it, or no matter what kind of understood you took from it, right? So when Reform Judaism began, right, back in the 18th century, right, Reform Judaism was the first kind of Judaism, right? Before that, there was just Judaism, right? And it wasn't Orthodox because there was no need for Orthodox Judaism. There was nothing to differentiate it from, right? It was just, there were different branches of Judaism depending on the geographical area where you lived. Then in Germany, right, in the 17th century, 18th century rather, the reformers came along and said the service is crazy, people make too much noise, no one's at the same place at the same time, the melodies are terrible, and we should be more like our German compatriots, right, who have decorous services, they have beautiful music, they have organs, they have sermons, right, they have all these type of things that, and so that's where so Reform comes along, and then Orthodoxy comes along after Reform to sort of say, no, 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 all of these changes are bad, right, and we need to preserve, what we've already got. So that sort of is the beginning of the denominational system in Judaism. And just FYI, right, that denominational system in Judaism really is a feature of Ashkenazi Judaism, right? In Sephardi Judaism, it's much less of a thing. There was no, right, very often people complain about, people who are vaguely Islamophobic will complain about Islam. Why isn't there a Reform Islam? Right? Well, we could say the same thing about Sephardic Judaism. Why isn't there Reformed Sephardic Judaism? Right? There just wasn't I'm sure there's all kinds of good and explainable historiographical reasons why that never happened, but it didn't, right? So there's much more fluidity among Sephardi Jews than there is among Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi, most of us here would identify as Ashkenazi. Most Jews in the United States, and just if you were wondering, if you convert into Judaism in a traditional setting, right, the community into which you convert is the community into which with which you identify. So most people convert into Ashkenazi identifying groups. So most converts are Ashkenazi in this country. Go ahead, Lori. Did you have a question?
Well, it's more something I'm puzzling about, and that is precisely the emphasis on liturgy.
He's in the kitchen.
And as you said, there's the precision with which one davens, whether or not one understands it, whether one chooses to daven in English because that's the language you were born into speaking. I personally find a conflict between liturgy and faith.
And what?
Say that again, Lord, last piece.
I personally find myself struggling in the conflict between liturgy and faith.
Oh, faith.
Yeah. So say more about what you mean by that conflict. How does that conflict
He has in the cabinet.
express itself?
I'm not sure. I think if I could have explained it differently, I would have. But basically, at the worship and study services, as a function of time, there has been much more interest in liturgy and precision and perfection and less emphasis on a discussion that may raise people to a common level of understanding of what they're doing there. And I find
It's right there.
that I have to sometimes just sit there quietly, because if I'm going to try to read in any language, everything that's being said, I'm going to get up and walk out because it's not speaking to me.
Right. All right. So you're, yeah, go ahead.
It's destroying my sense of what it means to be part of a community on Shabbat.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're raising something, I think, Lori, that's very, very important, right? And can be very, very off-putting to people who don't have, right, the kind of relationship to the liturgy that the tradition assumes, right? Which I'm not saying that it's, I'm not saying that that's a good thing or bad thing. I'm just saying that the tradition, right, assumes, and this is why, even though it might seem a little strange, why my plan today was to start with the weekday liturgy, right? So the tradition assumes, first of all, that we're davening every day, 3 times a day, right? It might be a bad assumption. I don't know in this room well enough, except for myself, to say that no one I know really, really well in this room, meaning myself, davens 3 times a day, right? I used to in rabbinical school, but I don't so much anymore. But one of the things that did for me as a Jew, right, was it gave me a level of familiarity with the fundamentals of the liturgy, so that I'm not I don't necessarily need to get stuck in that because I've done some of the digestive work. Go ahead, Ann.
Somebody needs to mute their microphone that has background talking.
All right, so I'll mute everyone right now. Thank you, Ann. I'll mute everybody, and then if you want to speak, please feel free to unmute yourself and let me know. Okay. So Lori is raising, as I've said, is raising a very, very important question, right? And so there's, as a practical matter, I think there are two important things to say, right? The first one is that the more familiar you become with the liturgy, right, the more it becomes your own, right? Which is not to say, right, that you suddenly become that your personal theology becomes identical to whatever the theology of the person who wrote that prayer was, right? But just that you have certain parts of the service that really speak to you, right? And those are the ones that, instead of trying to say every word perfectly, instead of trying to squeeze in every last sentence, right, you really focus on one particular line. And let me share with you one of those for me, right, which is in the first blessing, the first blessing before the Shema, right, which is called Yotzer, right, the creation, right, Yotzer Or, right. So if you have a prayer book in front of you, it can be from any denomination. If you look in the morning, you have to look in the morning service, and you will see, let's see if I can find it in this one. Yes, okay. So I'm looking at a Reform prayer book, for instance, right? At the end, let's see if I'm right. I hope I'm right about this one, because if it's not in here, I'm going to be really disappointed. This happens from time to time. I go to a service in a synagogue where I'm not familiar with the liturgy, and all of a sudden one of my favorite lines is not in the prayer book, and I have to do it by memory, and I'm like, why are they censoring what I'm reading in the prayer book? But that's another story. It looks like they don't have it. Okay, so I'm gonna have to go to a different one. All right. All right, so this one, if you're in the blue book, it means if you're in this red book, the Lev Shalem, this one will be on page 150. Okay. Actually, it's going to be easier to find because it actually is repeated. It'll be easier to find on page 152. Oh, no, sorry. Page 153, if you have this red book. It's actually at the very bottom of the page where there's a little arrow. It says Hamechadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reshit. Right? In God's goodness, in this translation, the work of creation is renewed each day. Okay, so a more literal translation would be the one, meaning God, God's self, right? The one who in God's goodness every single day continuously performs the works of creation, right? So every time that I daven, I'm attuned to that line. If I miss a whole bunch of the other stuff, there's some nice stuff, but really what matters is this line, right? The assurance that the work of creation is constantly being renewed, right? And that I'm part of that, right? And one of the wonderful things that's happened in science in recent years is the recognition. I mean, even when I was in college, right, there was no idea of brain plasticity, right? If once you lost the synapse, it was gone, right? You're never as smart as you were when you were 25, right? It's all downhill after that, right? And now we know with brain plasticity, right, that the work of creation is ongoing every single day, right? Every day we learn something, right? Our brains are being renewed. So that is sort of the ancient wisdom of the rabbis really works with modern science in this case. Go ahead, Ellen. Just unmute yourself though.
Unmute. I just, where, I'm on 153.
Yeah.
Where is what you,
At the very bottom, there's
Or Hadash,
right above Or Hadash. There's a red
Kavod?
there's a red arrow 4 lines from the bottom.
Yeah, oh, in God's goodness. Okay,
Yes.
all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. Exactly.
Thank you.
All right. So Lori, so a tachlis recommendation, right, for that feeling of like, oi, there's too many words. I don't resonate with any of these words, right? And it's getting in the way of me feeling like I'm a member of the community, right? One of the ways into that, right, is to sort of say, well, duh, the tradition knows it has too many words, right? And that's one of the reasons in a traditional service, right, the cantor doesn't actually chant every single word out loud, right? And that's why in Reform services, right, they pared back so much of the liturgy, right, so that everyone would say all the words together, right? And I think there's a reasonable kind of argument to be had about the relative value of the Reform sort of idea. Well, we should really decide what are the most important parts of the service, right? And those are the ones that should be in the prayer book, right? And the rest of it we should leave out, right? And a more traditional way of doing it, which would define all of the other denominations from renewal on through to Orthodox, where the prayer books get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And it gets easier and easier to get lost in the prayer books with all the words, right? But so the But the argument, I just made my argument, right, for why I fall more on that conservative side, right, of risking the getting lost, is because my favorite line in the Yotzer prayer doesn't show up in this particular Reformed prayer book, right? And so if I were davening in a community that uses this prayer book, right, I would have to, unless I knew it already, like I do, but that's only because I'm a rabbi, right? I would have to come up with it myself. And so, does that make sense, Lori, as a strategy?
Does. And maybe this is in keeping with the way I was brought up secularly and the rest of my secular education. I was always taught, and I'm interested in questioning, of delving.
Yes.
And I
100%.
can't do that if I'm racing through,
And I think,
even in English, or
right.
I read some words and I'm saying, well, I don't want to say this. This doesn't make sense. Now, I contrast that with something else that I carry around, which is the words of Judy Cates when she was a member of the congregation, which is, consider prayer like aerobics. You do them all the time so that they're there when you need them.
I love that. That's a great.
And it's.
Yeah, go ahead, Lori.
It's just an attempt to balance.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I would put it slightly different than aerobics. Although
well, they were popular at the time.
Right. No. I mean, and not because of the kind of exercise, so much as I would put it much more in the way of, this is an analogy that I've made before, right? Which is that very often, because of our secular educations, I include myself in this. I'm not making a distinction between me and other people here, but very often when we approach a prayer book, right, we approach it as propositions that can be proven or unproven, or things that are true or not true, right? As opposed to approaching prayer as poetry, and prayer as a kind of speech and a kind of activity that's very different than what we do when we're reading the newspaper, right? Or when we're reading a novel. And so I wanted to, so let me very briefly, what I'll say today about, the other thing about it, right, is that the tradition does not, even if we don't daven 3 times a day at home, right, the tradition does not assume that, because we were talking about how this is a liturgical religion, right? The tradition does not assume that we're seeing these words for the first time when we go to shul, right? They assume that we're seeing them already for whatever number of times we've been in shul before, right? And that we should give ourselves a break, right? We shouldn't expect ourselves to know everything in the prayer book if we haven't been doing it, right? So one of the things to do, right, is to look into the prayer book on a regular basis at home, right? Find those places in the prayer book, because there must be, I mean, if you wouldn't be here if there were nothing in the prayer book that appealed to you, right? Find those places that do appeal to you, right? And focus on those. Focus on how to say those in Hebrew fluently, right? Very, very slowly, not at the speed that I read them these days, right? But at the speed that you can read them, right? I was talking to Mira, the woman that was going to join us, but she's decided not to. She's a violinist, and she was complaining about how slowly she reads Hebrew. And I said, look, when you first started playing the violin, right, you weren't doing Paganini, right? You build up to Paganini, right? And you build up to Paganini by playing passages slowly and accurately, right? Again and again, right? And then eventually they become part of your muscle. And one of the wonderful things about a liturgical religion, and a lot of people would disagree with me, right? But for me, one of the great things about a liturgical religion, right, is that you are able to, as someone who's dying over the course of your lifetime, right, you are able to recognize that the prayers never changed, right? So as they do change, that means that the prayers are revealing something about you, right? And about how you have changed and you have grown. And it's similar to Torah, right? How do we read the same book every year, from cover to cover, or from each time to each time? We read the same. It's the same thing. Don't we ever get bored of it? Well, not really, right? Because every year we're really different, right? This year, as Carol and I were talking about the other day, right? These initial parshas in Exodus are so resonant with what's happening in our national life right now, right? And to see that would be impossible, right? I would argue, right, if we had never read Exodus before, if this was the first time we were seeing it, right, they wouldn't have that kind of resonance. All right, so other questions before we move on to a little bit of topless stuff. Go ahead, Sherry.
I just wanted to add that the structure of the prayers, as I understand, is set in the Mishnah, in the time of the Mishnah. So that there's a sort of skeleton of prayers that you always say that then that constitutes having said that prayer. That like if it's the morning prayer or the shacharit, or each one has its skeleton. And then added to that, you can add prayers, but that skeleton is something that you wouldn't take away from. And that's sort of what defines conservative Judaism, in that they stick to that Matbeah Shel Tefillah, the outline of the prayers. And the other point, if you don't mind, I wanted to make was that sometimes you can look at the prayers as needing, like, each individual prayer, does it speak to me? But maybe there's a benefit in just thinking of saying the whole prayers. And that Hillel and Shammai had a dispute about whether the commandments, whether you need to have your full intention, your kavanah, in the mitzvot, and they disagreed. And Shammai said that you just, that you had to, now I forget them straight, you had to have that intention, but Hillel said that it was just a matter of doing them. Or was it the other way around? Might have been the other way around. But if you look at the prayers, it's the same idea, that you can think of them as like speaking to you, or maybe it's just doing them that gives you that fulfillment.
And there's a reason, right, why our tradition insists upon bringing both Shammai and Hillel, right? Because there's a grain of truth in both of those, right? And so it's and yes, and also there's also the question of sort of, well, at what level are we looking at the prayers, right? Are we looking at a sentence level? Like I was just looking at that particular line, right, at a sentence level. I love that particular line, but there's also the context of, well, what prayer is that line a part of, right? And maybe you don't actually need to say every word of a prayer about creation, right? You can just say a few words of that prayer, and the rest of the time you're just meditating, right? Whether you're meditating on the theme of creation or you're just breathing, right? That's another reason why I think in traditional Judaism there's not the insistence that everyone be doing the same thing at the same time, right? Because they recognize that there's going to be some people who are better at what I think it's probably Shammai who's arguing for keva, right? Which is the fixed form of the prayer, right? And there's going to be some people who are more into kavanah, right? More into the intentionality of the prayer, right? And so if you're a keva person, great. Geek out like I geek out on trying to say every single word of every prayer every once in a while, just for fun, right? But if you're not a keva person, if you're a kavanah person, then don't do that, right? And the great thing about traditional Jewish prayer is that nobody cares, right? Because as long as you're not singing a Don Olam while everyone else is trying to say El Don, right? If you don't know what those two things are, don't worry about it, right? But as long as you're not disturbing everybody else, right, then what you're doing in your prayer is completely kosher. And just your presence at the synagogue, right, your intention of being there, right, is enough to make that intention valid. I'm hearing background noise. I think it might be Sherry. So Sherry, I'm gonna
I'm
mute you.
sorry.
That's okay. All right. So, but that's a great segue, Sherry. Thank you so much. It's a great segue into the next thing that I want to say. We just lost somebody. I don't know who it was. I don't know. It's so weird how people can disappear from Zoom and I don't even, the second that they disappear, I can't remember who was there. It's very strange. All right, well, hopefully they'll come back. All right. So what I wanted to say is, what is the keva, right? What is the keva of prayer that Sherry was talking about from the Mishnah, right? And a friend of mine and I are reading Maimonides right now in his Mishnah Torah, right? His repetition of the Torah, and he goes through, well, what are the constituent prayers of the tradition, right? So the first thing to know, right, is that the sort of the most fundamental form of a Jewish prayer, right? Ellen Kahn. Okay, thank you. The most fundamental unit of a Jewish prayer is the blessing, right? Most people here are probably aware of the Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kiddishanu Mitzvotav, and say La'asok B'divrei Torah, right? So which is the blessing that we say when we engage in Torah study. So it seemed like the appropriate one to say right now because we're learning Torah, right? The idea in Judaism, right, is that Torah is obviously the 5 books of Moses. It is also any other form of Jewish learning that we're doing. So it's almost always appropriate when we're learning to say that blessing. So the constituent parts of that blessing, right, are the Baruch, right? We bless, right? Blessed are you. Then we say the name of God, right? Which is in Hebrew is the Yud He Vav He, right? And we say it out loud as Adonai. And then Melech HaOlam, right? Sovereign of the universe, right? So what really is important about a blessing is that it invokes Shem Umalchut, they say, right? The name of God and God's sovereignty, right? And then we go Asher Kiddishanu B'mitzvotav, right? Who has sanctified us with mitzvot, right? Sanctified us with commandments, and has commanded us to do a certain thing. In this case, to engage in the study of Torah, right? So all throughout the prayer book, the central prayers of our tradition will have that formula, right? We can get deeper into what that means at a later time, but I just wanted to sort of, indicate to you, right, that you could go through your prayer book, and if you're someone who scribbles notes in your prayer book, that's completely fine. You can go and circle all the baruchs, right? And every time that you see a baruch, you know that this is kind of an important thing, right? This constitutes a blessing, right? Not necessarily the most important blessing or the thing that we say all the time, right? There's blessings that we only say on Pesach, or blessings that we only say on Rosh Hashanah or whatever, right? But you know that this is really a building block. And the other thing to know about blessings, right, is that we can make, as Sherry said, right, we can make all kinds, right, of new prayers, right? We are mishubach, right? We are to be praised, right? If we make up new prayers and add them to the service, right? But by and large, our tradition frowns upon making up new blessings. Right? We tend to be conservative in that sense, right? We like to stick to the blessings we've got. All right. So so in Judaism, you may have heard, right, that our calendar tends to want to begin days in the evening, right, at sundown. Right? When do we begin Shabbat? We begin Shabbat at sundown. When does our fast for Yom Kippur begin? It begins at sundown, right? So the first prayer to pay attention to is the evening prayer, right? And the evening prayer consists of the Shema and its blessings, and then the Amidah. Right now, those two components might be a little bit confusing. Right? You might not know what they are, and that's completely fine. If you do, then you're already way ahead of the game, right? And so that is essentially like that's the basics, right, of every Jewish prayer, Jewish prayer service, right, is going to be either the Shema and the Amidah together, or in the case of the afternoon prayer, just the Amidah. Okay, so, and the Shema is slightly different depending on whether it's the morning or the evening, right? And we'll come to that in just a minute. In the morning, right, we begin, the core of the service is also the Shema and its blessings and the Amidah. But we add what are called Zmirot, according to Rambam, right? Or in our current way of thinking about it, or the current word we use is called Pesuke de Zimra, verses of song, or verses of psalms. Okay, someone just joined us, 7808. Is that Fred? I think that is Fred. Fred, it's great to have you. If you can unmute yourself, it'd be great to hear your voice. Otherwise, it's just fine. You can listen, and you can pick up the rest of this video on YouTube later. So the basic morning service has those three sections. Now, there's other details. I'm not going to get into them right now because it's not that important for our folks, you know, for the way that we tend to do services. But on Mondays and Thursdays, after the Amidah, in a regular weekday, we will read Torah. And traditionally, we read the first aliyah, the first generally, 15 to 20 verses of whatever portion of the week. We read that on Mondays and Thursdays. We also read it on Saturday afternoons. So the liturgical week begins on Saturday afternoon. We read the portion of the week on Saturday morning in shul, and then Saturday afternoon in more traditional places, right? They will read the first aliyah of next week's portion. Already sort of saying it's already Saturday night. It's time to move to the next portion already. Right? We don't stick around. Right? We keep moving. Right? All right. So those are the basic parts of the service. If you were to look at Rambam, the only thing that would be added, right, is this idea of supplications. Right? And this is what Sherry was talking about, right? You can always add stuff. You can always add stuff. You can always add your own personal supplications to God, right, in the service. By and large, we've become increasingly, as I said, liturgical and less focused on adding things of our own. But that doesn't mean that we can't, right? So while everyone else is davening in the Amidah, right, you can ignore the text and make up your own prayers, right? And that's completely fine. It's more fine, according to the tradition, in a traditional place where the reader of the service reads the entire Amidah out loud, right? Because then he or she has done that for you, and the fact that you didn't do it yourself doesn't really matter. All right. Any questions about the general shape of the prayers? Oh, and I'm sorry. And then the afternoon prayer, right, is just the Amidah. Right? The afternoon prayer is just an Amidah. And you read Ashrei before it. Ashrei is a very important prayer. What I would recommend is that everyone, for their liturgical capacity, and for their and also just as a good practice for their Hebrew, right, is to choose Ashrei as a good text in Hebrew to read, and just read it nice and slowly, right, in a more traditional service than the worship and study service, right. Ashrei comes up again and again and again during the service, so you always have an opportunity to recite it, right, and it's enough of a tongue twister that it's really good practice if you're trying to get better at Hebrew. So if you have trouble finding it in your prayer book, just let me know what prayer book you have, and I will help you find it.
And it's alphabetical, so you can practice
It is alphabetical, exactly. It's an alphabetical acrostic, right? So you'll have a chance to say all the letters except for nun. There's no nun for whatever reason.
Rabbi Jim, I think a bunch of us are looking at this one, the one that you have.
Yes. Yes.
Not finding it. Could you just point us to a page where that?
It is on page 136.
Thank you.
It is also, in case you happen to be somewhere else, it also happens to be on page 181. And on page 181, there is transliteration to help you with the pronunciation, in case you.
Rabbi Jim, it
Yeah.
looked like Mayim held up the tan one, which is the Matzor.
No, it's the red one.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, the red one, it's on page, I recommend page 181 because of the if you're not familiar with Hebrew, there's good transliteration on page 181. And if you need a red book and you don't have one, please let me know, and I will do my best to get you one. Lisa and Fred, I'm not sure how I'm going to get you one, but I'll do my best. I'll do my best to figure it out. All right. All right. So that's the basic structure of a Jewish service. All right. And we will get into next time the specifics of the Shema and the Amida. I don't think that unless there's a great deal of interest, I don't think that I want to spend that much time on the weekday Amidah, because the worship and study minyan is primarily a Shabbat minyan, as is most of what we do at CCB. If there are people who feel strongly that they would like to learn the weekday Amidah with me, I'm happy to spend a little bit of time on it. But if it's not something that is of general interest, I don't want to use the time for this group. But we will focus on the Shabbat Amidah next time, and that will give you a chance to sort of have a look at what we do in our services on Friday night and on Saturday morning. And of course, on Saturday morning, there's two Amidahs, right? There's the Shacharit one, which is there's a Shacharit Amidah every day, right? And on Musaf and holidays, on Shabbat and holidays, there's a Musaf, and the only thing that Musaf means is additional, right? There's an additional opportunity, right, to pray. And we can get into a little bit of that next time. All right, so right now what I wanted to do is bring you an excerpt from a podcast that I was listening to the other day that I thought was really helpful in terms of thinking about prayer and ritual and religious questions. So this was a podcast in On Being, and I think I may have mentioned it to a few people already. It was Krista Tippett is the host, and she was interviewing in 2015 Mary Catherine Bateson, who recently passed away, who was an anthropologist and linguist, the daughter of Gregory Bateson and why is the name escaping me? She's so famous. Anyway.
Margaret Mead?
Margaret Mead. Thank you, Margaret Mead. Exactly, Margaret Mead. Thank you. And so there was a sort of just a section of this podcast that I just found to be very, very interesting. So I'll share that with you now, and we'll see how it goes. Give me a second here. Oh my gosh. Wait a second. I'm going to have to find it first because I was at a different meeting in the interim, and that has taken over my screen. Okay. This podcast that I just found to be very, very interesting. So I'll share that with you now, and we'll see how it goes. Give me a second here. Oh my gosh. I've gotten used to having two screens, and I have to say I'm very, very, very spoiled. And now that I have only one screen, it really is a pain. All right. So let's the end. All right. So she starts by saying, Tippett brings these lines of Kipling. So I'm just going to read it, and since I'm on the screen, Lori, would you be Dr. Bateson, and I can be Tippett? Lori, is that okay?
Yeah, sure thing.
Great, perfect. All right, and your mother, you quote these lines of Kipling that I was just so taken with. Kipling's description of heaven, which your mother loved. Heaven as a place of tireless creativity, but each for the joy of working, and each in his separate star.
His separate star will paint the thing as he sees it for the God of things as they are.
Isn't that a wonderful line? The God of things as they are.
It is wonderful. I love it.
And so just to break in, the reason even though this is not entirely relevant, the reason I love this quotation is because one of the definitions of heaven, the world to come, in the Jewish tradition, right, is that we all get to go up and learn Torah all the time. And so there's sort of the idea of learning Torah as tireless creativity. We just get to go up and be creative all the time and just build. I just love it. All right, so the next thing, your mother said this. You cite your mother as saying this very insightful, wonderful thing, that too many people, when they reject God, go on believing in the devil, that many intellectuals have a sense of evil without a confidence in good.
She did indeed say that, and she said it about some specific people. I think, what shall I say? I think I'm not happy with the division between people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious. To me, the starting place is the sense of wonder, and that can take you into science. It can take you into art. Other human beings are amazing and beautiful. The natural world around us, the more we study it, the more fascinating and intricate and elegant it turns out to be.
Thank you.
That's my interpretation of the book of Job, incidentally. My father used to say that Job gets over his distress by learning some natural history. But I don't think it is a matter of, God, you remember in the book of Job, God says, do you know why the rains fall here and not there? When the deer bring forth their young, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds like a quiz on nature studies.
That's right, yeah.
But that's not really what it is. I think the point about the book of Job is that Job is a virtuous member of an institution. He's respectable. He obeys all the rules. He's complacent. He goes through the appropriate rituals that are required in his community at that time, but he's lost his sense of wonder. And then God says, look, just look, realize how beautiful it is, how complicated it is, the wonder of creation. And he wakes up. I actually got interested in the sense of wonder because, for a series of historical reasons, I know a lot about Judaism. I lived my last year of high school in Israel. And then I came back and decided I want to learn about Islam. And so I studied Arabic.
And then you spent a good amount of time in Iran. before the revolution. You had made a home there.
About 7 years. Well, 6 years, say. So I thought I should be doing something to address the Islamophobia, the hostility, the prejudice that has grown up in this country after 9/11. The way I went about it was to say, what is it that makes me, as a Christian, empathize with a Muslim? At what point are we together? And what struck me is that actually all three of the religions that come from Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that what we all have in common is the sense of wonder that leads to praise. That is to say, when you go from wonder to a religious context, shared worship, something like that, it takes the form of praise. And in spite of the huge differences in other aspects of the traditions, a different set of rules, expectations, behaviors, ta-dum, 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 praise is central to all of them.
So you feel like, even as an anthropologist, that sense of wonder is as much what religion keeps alive for human beings as ritual.
Yes, I think ritual is an important part of it because ritual is constantly building. You repeat the same thing at different stages of your life and you're putting new layers of meaning. You're re-recognizing the familiar.
But there's something you wrote that, again, I just want to say your writing is so beautiful, and so I'm doing a lot of bringing it into this conversation, but I feel like it has its rightful place. You wrote, and this to me, it gets at ritual as something that is also that even the rituals of our personal lives have more than just personal meaning. You wrote, we talk in this country about property rights. We talk more rarely about the shares people have in each other's lives and about people's rights to participation and pleasure, especially at the moments of passage. The right to throw a handful of earth on a coffin, the right to stand up to catch a tossed bouquet, and the dream of one's own future wedding, to kiss the bride or groom or hold a newborn. Couples today devise new rituals or set up housekeeping together in ways most meaningful to themselves, without wondering whether meaning is something they owe to the larger community. Seems like such an important question, a statement to me. So I think that's all I've got. Yeah, that's the whole thing. So I just wanted to give people a chance to reflect on some of what is in that, I think admittedly very, very, very rich passage. Yeah, go ahead, Ann. You're unmuted. You're muted though.
I'm leaving to go to my Oregon meeting.
That's great. Great to see you.
See you tonight.
All right. So reactions. Go ahead, Helen.
Oh, I thought it was very interesting to think about religion from a more scientific anthropological perspective, as she said. I had the opportunity actually to be at a couple meetings with her, and a very interesting person. But the thing at the end that we read about our personal rituals, not caring so much if they mean something to the community, but rather that they mean something to us, made me think about that as distinct from religion. I mean, because I don't know, I wanted to know more what you thought about that sentence.
Yeah, I found it to be really fascinating. And I think it also is very interesting, that we start from a place of wonder and we move to a place of praise, right? And then that moves directly into that question of ritual and the personal versus the communal experience of ritual. Go ahead, Sherry.
Oh, just that we were just reading Heschel in our Maya class, and this is exactly what he says, that you start from wonder, and wonder brings you into the mitzvah. It's the road you would take in Judaism.
Right, I think, right, and it's very interesting, right, that he's going to make this sort of cross-cultural argument, right, that Islam and Christianity, along with Judaism, right, begin from this place of wonder and transform it into praise, right? And it's one of the things, to be honest, that people very often find off-putting about worship, right? And again, Jewish, Islamic, or Christian, right? Is that there's so much of an emphasis on praise of God, right? And it raises the question: well, does God really need all that praise, right? And this sort of gives sort of an understanding, right, that it's not really right about stroking God's ego, right? It's about having a channel for the expression of the amazing wonder of the world, right? So there's a series of blessings that, again, if you have the red prayer book, you'll see them very early in the morning service, it's called the morning blessings, right? And the Reform movement has a wonderful way of talking about them. Let's see, in this book, it's on page 103, right? Blessings for a new day. And I wonder if it's in here, but I love the way the Reform movement talks about it. Something about like everyday miracles or something like this. Let's see here. Yes, for daily miracles, right? And just sort of now, on one hand, right, a miracle can't be a daily occurrence, otherwise it's not a miracle, right? On the other hand, right, recognizing that there is something sort of miraculous, right, in the workings of our bodies, right? And that by praising God, right, for that, right, we are finding a way of expressing our wonder, right, and turning it from, sort of a inchoate or wordless kind of wonder into an expression, right, into a way of talking. Right? Yes, I agree. Man in Search of God is a great thing to look at. All right, so I think that's where yeah, go ahead, Ellen, please. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, you're still muted, Ellen. There you go.
One of the differences between what I knew as very Orthodox, so-called, but they were just old man mumbling, was there no one ever sang anything. There was no music, and it never dawned on me until I started coming to the services here. And music and joyfulness is part of it here. Never dreamed in my life that was part of Judaism. And for Lori, I just wanted to point that out because it's a different feeling maybe from what you grew up with. And I also suggest reading some things by Mordecai.
Mordecai Kaplan.
Yes. I knew the family and I briefly knew him. And I once had to deal with a funeral, and I went to the synagogue that was his on West 86th Street in Manhattan, and it was a kind of eye-opener on what Judaism was about. Not that I understood anything, but it was different from anything I'd ever encountered. And that's partly why I wanted to go to the services here, thanks to Harriet, because I wanted to find out what my life as a Jewish person had as its roots. I had no way of dealing with it. I used to read books and I still read books, but it's not quite the same. And I just recommend that to you because it was Kaplan's works has something that may resonate for you. That was the word you used, that it didn't. And Heschel, of course.
It's actually really hard to overstate Kaplan's influence on American Judaism. yes, no, I'm sorry, I have a tendency to get excited, and we get overwhelmed. So we will end these sessions. I will hope I will not fall prey to regularly going over, but unfortunately they tend to raise lots of issues and lots of questions and thoughts and conversations. So I think we're going to have to be doing a balancing act between respecting everyone's time and closing at 1, and then respecting everyone's voice and giving people a chance to express themselves towards the end of the service. I mean, towards the end of the hour. So we'll be balancing. But if you need to go at 2 o'clock, please rest assured that the conversation will be captured on YouTube, and you can come back and look at it later.
Okay. Well, it's like 10 after 2 already, so I'm gonna have to go.
So yeah. So Mayim, did you have something you wanted to say before you say goodbye?
No, thank you for the lesson. You know, I'm not sure I got everything down about the structure of the service. If it wouldn't be too much and you send out anything after this, just briefly, the list of.
I'm going to try, I think I'm going to do that next week. I'm going to try to have something, something written out, either that I steal from some other authority or I make up myself quick and dirty. That sort of gives that synopsis.
Yeah, simple would be good, like, Shema, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
I would just like to add that women are not part of the service. They're upstairs. They're supposed to be talking about children and recipes. So some equality for women is way overdue, as well as being able to read, not a couple of people interpreting. They have brains.
You're right.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
100%.
Well, you can try the worship and study service, and you'd be hard pressed to find a man that's involved.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Don't forget Miriam
Anyway, so
dancing.
And I have a session planned.
Everyone who needs to leave. I was just gonna add to the people who are left that I have a whole pile of books that I was gonna do a show and tell, but we got into interesting conversation instead. So I will, yes, to pray as a Jew. Carol just mentioned to pray as a Jew, and that was one of the books that I brought along for show and tell. It is an old book, and he is Orthodox. So you have to, as Sandy points out, he is not a feminist. I don't even know if he knew what a feminist was. So you have to read all the older things, right? With that, without being an agent of presentism, right? The idea that we are so enlightened and we know all the answers about inclusion and diversity and blah blah blah, and so we have to right, so we need to make sure that obviously we're being as respectful as we can to earlier voices, which in our tradition is the only way to do it. But yes, by Chaim Halevi Donin, to pray as a Jew is one of the things that you can look at. If you don't have an Orthodox prayer book and you're interested in having one, the one I recommend is the Koren, Koren. This one has commentary by Lord Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, who recently passed away. It's got and I like this particular edition because of the way that it's laid out. It makes it much easier to follow than other editions that just kind of splat all the words in an undifferentiated mass on the page. And then I will also, there are two other books that might be in terms of the structure of the prayers. One is called Entering Jewish Prayer. It's like Donin, a little bit more contemporary, but still not new by any stretch of the imagination. This is from the early 90s. So really before before egalitarianism had really taken hold in mainstream Judaism. And then here's another one called, I'll be done in just a minute. Pray Tell, I don't know if this is in print anymore.
Pray tell.
Pray Tell. It's the Hadassah Guide to Jewish Prayer. And then finally, a book that you might find interesting. I found bits and pieces of it interesting, Making Prayer Real. So Lori, this one in particular might be interesting for you, right? Someone who really, if people struggle with trying to figure out what the heck am I doing here, right? Amid all these other people, and what are they doing anyway?
You
This
have,
book might.
yeah.
I just
Service
want
of-
to say, when they talk about wonder, I think of babies. Everything to them is wonder.
Yeah, I love that, Ellen, because it points to, Mary Catherine Bateson talked about the resonance among Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, right, with the emphasis on wonder, right? But for me, when you talk about babies, right, that brings in a resonance with Buddhism, right? The idea of a beginner's mind, right, of just being open, right, to the wonder of the world, and looking at it anew, looking at it afresh, right? That, for instance, in the Shabbat evening service, right, on Kabbalat Shabbat, we sing this song, right? It says, Shiru Ladonai Shir Hadash, sing to God a new song. Well, we sing the same damn song every Friday night. How could it possibly be new, right? And right, and so the idea of this being like a baby, right, being like a child, looking at things with fresh eyes every week, right, being open to what's new, even in things that obviously are.
I like Service of the Heart by Evelyn Garfield, where she talks about the structure of prayer also.
Lovely. I don't know that book at all.
Yeah, it's
Read it again.
Thank you.
Service of the Heart
Service of
by
the Heart.
Evelyn Garfield.
Great, thank you. And that term, by the way, and this will end, right? That term is from the Hebrew avodah shebalev, right? That signifies the synagogue service, right? Avodah is holy labor, right? Holy work, and avodah is that's what we call the sacrifices in the temple. That was the avodah, right? And so when Jews shifted from making sacrifices in the temple to a liturgical based religion, right, the same word was used, but instead of the physical sacrifices, right, we're making the labor, the avodah, the service of our hearts. All right, thank you, everybody. To be continued next week. I'll send out another note next week. And Lisa and Fred and Kent will, I'll be in touch, and we'll try to figure out a way to get you the prayer book that everyone else has. I think for Lisa and Fred, I can send a PDF to Donna, and she can print it out for you. Kent, I'm not sure. We'll have to figure out a way for you to get to Brookline and pick one up or something.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Rabbi Jim? Oh,
Yeah.
This is Kent. I have a prayer book.
Oh, good. Great. Okay.
yes.
Perfect.
Rabbi Jim, I wanted to say I have a red Siddur also.
Phenomenal. You're way ahead. Okay, good. That's great. And Fred, I'm not sure that you have one or not, but you can let me know, and we'll go from there. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much for everything today.